In 1957, state troopers stumbled upon dozens of luxury cars at a farmhouse in upstate New York. Inside were the most dangerous men in America, mob bosses from across the nation. The man who organized this meeting ran his criminal empire for longer than any other mafia boss in history. He survived bombs, grenades, and countless assassination attempts. This is how Stefano Magaddino, known as the Undertaker, built a shadow kingdom that lasted over half a century. Welcome back to EverKnownOfficial. Don't forget to like the video. Stefano Magaddino was born on October 10, 1891, in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily. The small coastal town, perched on the northwestern edge of the island, had already produced more mafia bosses per square mile than perhaps any other place on Earth. But even in this cradle of organized crime, the Magaddino name carried special weight. When he was born, the Magaddinos were involved in an underworld feud with the Buxalato family. Blood feuds weren't just stories told around dinner tables, they were the reality young Stefano breathed every day. His childhood wasn't filled with games or school lessons like other children. Instead, it was marked by whispered conversations about revenge, loyalty, and the ancient codes of honor that governed life and death in their world. Magaddino's father, Giovanni Magaddino, was the brother of Joseph Bonanno's maternal grandmother. These family connections would later prove invaluable in America, creating bonds stronger than steel between crime families separated by an ocean. The feud that shaped his early years wasn't some minor disagreement. He had strong links with the Bonanno family in Sicily, joining forces with Joe's father, Salvatore, in 1899 after the latter's brothers, Stefano and Giuseppe, were killed on an order given by Felis Buxalato. At just 8 years old, Stefano witnessed the brutal reality of Sicilian justice. Bonanno and Magaddino took their revenge by ordering the killing of 2 members from the Buxalato family. This cycle of violence would follow him across the Atlantic, shaping the man who would one day rule the American underworld. Stefano Magaddino, born on October 10, 1891, in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, immigrated to the United States at age 17, arriving in New York Harbor aboard the SS San Giorgio on February 7, 1909. When the teenager first glimpsed the Statue of Liberty rising from New York Harbor, he carried with him more than just hopes for a better life. He brought the violence, the codes, and the hunger for power that would transform him from a Sicilian peasant into one of the most feared men in America. He initially settled in the Williamsburg-Ridgewood area of Brooklyn, a burgeoning enclave for Sicilian immigrants from his hometown, where waves of arrivals from southern Italy between 1900 and 1910 numbered over 1.2 million. Often facing acute economic pressures, including low-wage labor, overcrowded tenements, and exclusion from mainstream job markets. The streets of Brooklyn weren't paved with gold as the stories promised. They were covered in mud, garbage, and the broken dreams of countless immigrants struggling to survive. But Stefano wasn't like the other immigrants content to work themselves to death in factories for pennies. He had connections, family members who'd already established themselves in this new world. More importantly, he had skills, not the kind you'd put on a job application, but the kind that made men rich in the shadows of legitimate society. Magaddino quickly established himself in New York's underworld and became a group leader in his Mafia clan, extorting, stealing, and cheating his way to success and wealth. Within months of arriving, young Stefano had earned a reputation. He quickly established his group of Castellammare's mafiosi, known as the Good Killers, as a powerful presence in the underworld. The name was darkly ironic. There was nothing good about what they did, except perhaps their efficiency at it. In the early 1920s, Stefano Magaddino gained early notoriety as a leader of the Good Killers, a group of Castellammare Sicilians accused of multiple contract murders amid ongoing feuds stemming from the New York Camorra Mafia wars of the 1910s. These weren't random acts of violence. Each killing was calculated, each murder a message written in blood that the Castellammares were not to be trifled with. The good killers operated with a brutal simplicity. If you crossed them, if you threatened their interests, if you stood in their way, you disappeared. Sometimes bodies would turn up days later as warnings. Sometimes they'd never be found at all. Fontana claimed he murdered Caiazzo at the behest of the good killers, a group of mafiosi who hailed from Castellamare del Golfo, in retaliation for Caiazzo's involvement in the 1916 murder of Magaddino's brother, Pietro, back in Sicily. The murder of his brother Pietro had followed Magaddino across the ocean like a curse. The Buxalato clan's reach was long, and they hadn't forgotten the old feuds. When they struck down Pietro in 1916, they probably thought they'd sent a message to the upstart Magaddino family. They were wrong. All they'd done was sign their own death warrants. In August 1921, a barber named Bartolo Fontana turned himself into the New York police, confessing to murdering Camillo Caiazzo a couple of weeks earlier in Avon, New Jersey. Fontana claimed he murdered Caiazzo at the behest of the good killers, a group of mafiosi who hailed from Castellamare del Golfo, in retaliation for Caiazzo's involvement in the 1916 murder of Magaddino's brother, Pietro, back in Sicily. When the police came for him, it seemed like Magaddino's American dream might end before it truly began. Fearing he might be murdered, Fontana agreed to help police set up a sting operation. Stefano Magaddino met Fontana at Grand Central Station to give Fontana $30 to help him flee the city. After the exchange, Magaddino was arrested by a group of undercover police. $30, that's all it cost to try to buy a man's silence and loyalty. In 1921, that was good money, enough to get someone far from New York. But it wasn't enough to keep Magaddino out of handcuffs. New Jersey decided not to pursue conspiracy charges in the Caiazzo murder, and the charges against Magaddino were dropped despite the New York police officer's testimony about the sting linking him to the murder. The authorities had him dead to rights, witnesses, evidence, everything they needed. But somehow, mysteriously, it all fell apart. Witnesses changed their stories. Evidence disappeared, the charges evaporated like morning mist. This was Magaddino's first lesson in American justice: it could be bought, intimidated, or simply made to look the other way. But he also learned another lesson: New York was getting too hot. But during the early 1920s, he was forced to flee the city and relocate up to the Buffalo area because of the intense police scrutiny he received after being arrested in a highly publicized mafia, vendetta, murder investigation. Buffalo in 1922 wasn't anyone's idea of paradise, winters that could freeze a man's blood in his veins, summers humid enough to make breathing feel like drowning. But for a man like Stefano Magaddino, it was perfect. Di Carlo ran the Buffalo family until his death in 1922. Palmieri then invited Magaddino to take over for Di Carlo. Upon his arrival, Magaddino began to build an empire in western New York. The invitation didn't come from nowhere. The Buffalo crime family needed fresh blood, new leadership, someone with the connections and the ruthlessness to take them to the next level. Angelo Buffalo Bill Palmieri saw in Magaddino exactly what he needed: a killer with vision. A thug with ambition, a man who understood that in America, crime could be organized like a business. Although he operated a legitimate funeral home business in Niagara Falls, New York, the Magaddino Memorial Chapel, with prohibition in effect in the United States, Magaddino made his real money running a profitable bootlegging business by smuggling wine and spirits across the Niagara River into New York State, thereby supplying the needs of speakeasies located in Buffalo and the very honky-tonk Niagara Falls. The funeral home was perfect cover. Who questions a hearse crossing the border? Who looks too closely at coffins being transported for burial? The dead don't talk, and neither did the bottles of Canadian whiskey hidden beneath them. Magaddino turned death into profit in more ways than one. While he buried bodies in the cemetery, he was building an empire on the profits from illegal liquor. The geography was a gift from God, or perhaps the devil. When Prohibition began in 1920, Niagara Falls was more than a natural wonder, it was a gold mine. The border became a smuggler's dream, short crossings, foggy nights, and endless demand. Stefano Magaddino saw what others didn't, that the river itself could be turned into a highway of profit. Every night boats crossed the dark waters. In winter, when the river partially froze, they used sleds. The roar of the falls covered the sound of engines, the mist hid the movements. His men moved millions of dollars in Canadian whiskey and wine across the water each year. Hidden in trucks, fishing boats, and even coffins from his funeral home. By the early 1930s, the operation was generating what would be tens of millions in today's dollars, untaxed. Untraceable and unstoppable. The money wasn't just good, it was astronomical. While honest men broke their backs for $15 a week, Magaddino's operation was pulling in thousands every night. The speakeasies couldn't get enough Canadian liquor. Every jazz club, every underground casino. Every place where people went to forget Prohibition's harsh reality, they all needed what Magaddino was selling. But running liquor was just the beginning. After Prohibition ended, Magaddino and his crime family made their money by means of loan sharking. Illegal gambling, extortion, carjacking, and labor racketeering. Gaining control, too, of lucrative legitimate businesses such as taxi companies and the laundry and linen services essential to the area's many hotels. The end of Prohibition in 1933 could have destroyed lesser criminals. But Magaddino was already thinking ahead. He'd used the bootlegging profits to build something bigger, a network of corruption that reached into every corner of Buffalo society. Judges, cops, politicians, union leaders, they all had their hands out, and Magaddino made sure they were well greased. By the late 1920s, storm clouds were gathering over the American Mafia. In New York, a war was brewing that would determine the future of organized crime in America. The Castellamers faction in the U.S. included Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, Stefano the Undertaker Magaddino, Joseph Prophesy, and Joe Aiello. On the other side stood Joe, the boss Masseria, who wanted to be the supreme ruler of all the families. He played a pivotal role during the infamous so-called Castellamers War, which was fought between 1929 and 1931. Magaddino continuously supplied gunmen, guns, and ammunition, and financial support to his compare New York City leader Salvatore Maranzano and fellow Castellamers amici, which greatly helped in the fight against their rival Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, and his troops. From his base in Buffalo, Magaddino became the arsenal of the Castellamers cause. Every week, cars loaded with Thompson submachine guns, shotguns, and ammunition made the journey from Buffalo to New York. Every week, envelopes fat with cash traveled the same route. Magaddino wasn't just supporting the war, he was bankrolling it. The war played out on the streets of New York like something from the Old Testament. Bodies piled up in barbershops, restaurants, and street corners. The opening salvo in the feud was fired within the Masseria faction when, on February 26, 1930, Masseria ordered the murder of an ally, Gaetano Riene. Masseria gave the job to a young Genovese, who killed Riene with a shotgun. As the violence escalated, Magaddino's role became even more crucial. He wasn't just sending supplies, he was providing safe houses for Castellamers soldiers on the run, arranging medical care for the wounded, and most importantly, keeping the supply lines open when Masseria tried to cut them off. The war reached its climax in 1931. After months of bloodshed, a young upstart named Lucky Luciano engineered a solution that would change the Mafia forever. Masseria was killed in a Coney Island restaurant, shot while playing cards. Maranzano's faction prevailed in the conflict and divided New York's crime families into the 5 families. Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti I capi, boss of all bosses. Maranzano was murdered in September 1931 on orders of Lucky Luciano, who established a power-sharing arrangement through a governing body called the Commission, giving equal stature to all Mafia families to avoid such feuds in the future. In 1931, the family boss, Stefano Magaddino, became an original member of the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia. This wasn't just a promotion, it was recognition that Magaddino had arrived as one of the most powerful criminals in America. The Commission was designed to prevent future wars, to settle disputes peacefully, to run organized crime like a business rather than a blood feud. For Magaddino, sitting on the Commission meant his empire was now legitimate in the eyes of the underworld. Magaddino's strongest ally on the Commission was his nephew Joseph Bonanno. The two mafia bosses were from the same Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo. The Commission decided in 1931 that Stefano Magaddino and his Buffalo family would control Ontario, Canada, and that Joseph Bonanno and his Bonanno family would control Quebec, Canada. With this division of territory, Magaddino's empire truly became international. The entire Golden Horseshoe of Ontario, from Fort Erie to Toronto to Hamilton, became his personal fiefdom. His underworld influence stretched from Ohio to southern Ontario and as far east as Montreal, Quebec. No other American mafia boss controlled territory in two countries. No other boss had the vision to see that the future of organized crime lay not just in American cities, but in international operations. The 1930s and 1940s were Magaddino's golden years. Magaddino led his Buffalo family through its glory years and its most powerful and profitable era. He was an old-style boss who preferred to stay in the background and not draw any attention to himself or his criminal activities if possible. While flashier bosses in New York made headlines, Magaddino built his empire quietly, methodically. He ran his family like a corporation, with himself as CEO. There were departments for different operations: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering. Each had its own hierarchy, its own accounting, its own territories. But everything ultimately answered to Don Stefano. Magaddino's empire was run like a family, literally. His son Peter Magaddino became a made man in the Buffalo family, while his daughters married into other local mafia families, the Montanas, LaDucas, and Scrows, cementing alliances across the region. These weren't just marriages, they were mergers, creating a web of blood and business that made his organization nearly impenetrable. The legitimate businesses provided perfect cover for the illegal operations. Accompanying his illegal rackets were legitimate businesses, including the Magaddino Memorial Chapel, the Power City Distributing Company of Niagara Falls, and the Camellia Linen Supply Company of Buffalo. The linen company alone serviced most of the hotels in the region. Every tablecloth, every bedsheet, every towel, they all came from Magaddino. And with them came influence, information, and access. But power attracts enemies like blood attracts sharks. On May 19, 1936, during a period of intense gangland conflict in western New York, rivals detonated a bomb at 1651 Whitney Avenue in Niagara Falls, intending to kill Magaddino but targeting the wrong address, which resulted in the death of his sister instead. The bombers had gotten the address wrong, a fatal mistake that cost an innocent woman her life. Magaddino's sister died for the crime of sharing his blood. The attack shook Magaddino but didn't break him. If anything, it made him more careful, more paranoid, more ruthless. He moved between safe houses, never sleeping in the same bed 2 nights in a row. He varied his routes, changed his routines, trusted no one completely. Survival in his world meant assuming everyone wanted you dead until proven otherwise. Magaddino was a charter member of Charles "Lucky" Luciano's Mafia Commission and attended important underworld summits such as the 1946 Havana Conference and the 1957 Appalachian Conference. These weren't social gatherings, they were board meetings of Crime Incorporated, where territories were divided, disputes were settled, and the future of organized crime was planned. The 1946 Havana Conference was particularly significant. Lucky Luciano, deported to Italy, had made his way to Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. The biggest names in organized crime gathered at the Hotel National. discussing everything from casino operations to drug trafficking. Magaddino was there, one of the elder statesmen now, his opinion carrying weight that few could match. But it was another meeting, 11 years later, that would change everything. November 14, 1957, started like any other day in the small hamlet of Appalachian, New York. The locals were used to seeing expensive cars at Joe Barbara's estate. He was a successful businessman. After all, a beer distributor with connections. What they didn't know was that Barbara was also a capo in Magaddino's crime family. And his estate was about to host the most important Mafia summit in American history. The meeting was reportedly originally set for Chicago, but Genovese decided to have it in Appalachian at the urging of Buffalo. New York boss and commission member Stefano "The Undertaker" Magaddino, and despite the objections of Chicago outfit boss Sam Giancana. Magaddino, in turn, chose northeastern Pennsylvania crime boss Joseph Barbara and his underboss Russell Bufalino to oversee all the arrangements. Magaddino's choice of location would prove to be the worst decision of his criminal career. He thought the rural setting would provide privacy, that the country cops would be too unsophisticated to notice or care. He was catastrophically wrong. Local and state law enforcement became suspicious when numerous expensive cars bearing license plates from around the country arrived in what was described as the sleepy hamlet of Appalachian. Sergeant Edgar Croswell of the New York State Police had been keeping an eye on Barbara for years. When he noticed the unusual number of luxury cars, he knew something big was happening. State troopers noticed all the fancy cars parked in Barbara's driveway and started taking down license plate numbers. Some have suggested that one of Genovese's rivals tipped the cops. In hopes of spoiling Genovese's crown ceremony, the troopers caught about 60 of them. When questioned, many insisted they were there for a barbecue, or that they had just come to visit their good friend Joe Barbara, who was recovering from a heart attack. The scene that unfolded was almost comical if it weren't so serious. Some of America's most dangerous criminals, men who'd ordered hundreds of deaths between them, running through the woods in their expensive suits and Italian leather shoes. Mob bosses worth millions stumbling through mud and brambles like panicked deer. The most powerful criminal organization in America, reduced to a group of old men fleeing from a handful of state troopers. In fact, most of the crime bosses who were detained were those that attempted to flee the scene, while those who remained inside the house, such as Magaddino, remained free. Magaddino, older and wiser than many of his peers, stayed put. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He sat in Barbara's living room and waited. When the police came, he had his story ready. He was just visiting an old friend, nothing more. Magaddino, who had underestimated the police, escaped by traipsing through the muddy woods in his suit. Different accounts tell different stories, but what's certain is that Magaddino avoided arrest that day. Whether through cunning or luck, he escaped the immediate consequences of what became known as the Appalachian disaster. But for many years before Appalachian, the FBI refused to even admit that the Mafia existed. Edgar Hoover felt that communists and domestic subversives were the major threats facing the country, and he directed the Bureau's resources toward neutralizing them. They couldn't ignore what happened at Appalachian, though. The raid changed everything. Longtime FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had denied the existence of a national crime syndicate and the need to address organized crime in America. After the Appalachian Summit, Hoover could no longer deny the syndicate's existence and its influence on the North American underworld, as well as Cosa Nostra's overall control and influence of the syndicate's many branches throughout North America and abroad. After the Appalachian meeting, Edgar Hoover created the Top Hoodlum program and went after the syndicate's top bosses throughout the country. For Magaddino, Appalachian was the beginning of the end, though it would take years for the full consequences to play out. Following the raid, arrests and indictments, Genovese and Giancana blamed Buffalo crime boss Magaddino for the trouble surrounding the Cosa Nostra after Appalachian. Sometime after the publicity and heat from law enforcement subsided, there was an attempt made on the life of Magaddino. In 1958, another attempt occurred when an assassin hurled a hand grenade through a window into the kitchen of Magaddino's home on Dana Drive in Lewiston, New York, but the device failed to detonate properly and caused no injuries. The message was clear. His peers blamed him for the disaster, for bringing the FBI down on all their heads. The grenade might have been a dud, but the warning was real. The 1960s brought new challenges and new enemies. The FBI, now fully aware of the Mafia's existence and structure, began an unprecedented assault on organized crime. FBI agents planted their eavesdropping devices, while Peter Magaddino and his uncle Antonio, Stefano's brother, who was arrested at the 1957 Appalachian mob meeting, controlled the funeral chapel. Law enforcement officials later said they snooped on the Magaddino chapel and other places from 1961 until 1965, eventually amassing more than 75 pages of hushed conversations. The bugs were everywhere: in his funeral home, in his son's house, in the social clubs where his men gathered. For 4 years, the FBI listened to everything, every conversation, every plan, every secret. Magaddino, who had survived by being careful, by keeping his business quiet, suddenly found his every word potentially recorded and transcribed. But the real blow came in 1968. Magaddino's empire began to crumble in 1968 when the FBI found $500 stashed away in Magaddino's funeral home and his son's attic. $500,000 in cash, hidden while Magaddino had been telling his soldiers that times were tough, that there was no money for bonuses or payments. A raid on his son's home in Niagara Falls led to the discovery of approximately $473,134 in a suitcase. This created great animosity between the Buffalo family members and the Magaddinos, and led to a breakdown of their cooperation concerning criminal activities. For men who lived by a code of honor, who risked their lives for the family, this was the ultimate betrayal. Their boss, their father figure, had been hoarding money while they struggled. The Buffalo family split into dissident factions. The leaders met in Rochester at the end of 1968, and by early 1969 ousted Magaddino as boss, leaving him to lead a faction made up of his once powerful in-laws and older crime family members, from 1969 until he died several years later. The coup was bloodless but devastating. Part 2, Stefano Magaddino, the Mafia boss who ruled Buffalo for over 50 years. The year 1969 found Stefano Magaddino in a position he'd never imagined, powerless in the city he'd ruled for nearly 5 decades. At 78 years old, the man who'd once made judges tremble and police commissioners look the other way was now just another old Italian grandfather living in western New York. Except this grandfather had blood on his hands and secrets that could destroy dozens of powerful men. The coup that removed him from power hadn't involved bullets or bombs. It was quieter, more civilized, but no less brutal. The Young Turks in his organization, men he'd raised in the life, men who'd kissed his ring and called him godfather, had simply decided he was done. The discovery of the hidden money had given them the excuse they needed. In the world of organized crime, greed was expected, but hoarding from your own family was unforgivable. Magaddino tried to maintain his dignity, tried to pretend he was still the boss. He held court in his funeral home, surrounded by the few loyalists who remained, mostly family members too bound by blood to abandon him, and old-timers who remembered when his word was law from Buffalo to Montreal. But everyone knew the truth. The king was dead, even if he was still breathing. The FBI, meanwhile, was closing in. The thousands of hours of recordings they'd gathered were being transcribed, analyzed, turned into evidence. Federal prosecutors were building cases not just against Magaddino, but against the entire structure of organized crime in America. The bugs had captured everything: discussions of murders, extortion plots, the intricate details of how the American Mafia operated. In 1968, Magaddino had been indicted on charges of interstate gambling, but that was just the beginning. The government had learned from its mistakes. They weren't going to try to get him for murder or assault crimes that required witnesses who could be intimidated or killed. Instead, they were going after the money, using the same tactics that had brought down Al Capone decades earlier. Life magazine published a major exposé on Magaddino in 1969, calling him one of the most powerful crime bosses in America, even as his empire crumbled around him. The article featured photographs of the old man, looking frail and harmless. Nothing like the terrifying figure who'd once commanded an army of killers. Americans reading the magazine over breakfast could hardly believe this grandfather-looking figure was supposedly a monster. But those who knew the truth understood that appearances were deceiving. Behind those tired eyes was a mind that had orchestrated hundreds of crimes. That had built a criminal empire spanning 2 countries. That had survived assassination attempts, gang wars, and decades of law enforcement attention. Stefano Magaddino might have been old, might have been weakened, but he was still dangerous. The stress of his fall from power took its toll on his health. The man who'd survived bombs and bullets was being killed slowly by time and pressure. His heart, which had endured decades of looking over his shoulder, was failing. His body, which had carried him from the poverty of Sicily to the heights of American organized crime, was breaking down. Yet even in his decline, Magaddino commanded a certain respect. When he entered a room, conversations still stopped. When he spoke, people still listened. He was like a deposed monarch who still wore his invisible crown, a reminder of what he had been and what he had built. The early 1970s brought more legal troubles. Federal authorities were determined to make an example of him, to show that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. But prosecuting Magaddino was like trying to grab smoke. Witnesses developed sudden memory problems, documents disappeared. Jurors received anonymous phone calls suggesting their families might be happier if they voted to acquit. In 1973, Magaddino was tried on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice. But the case fell apart when key witnesses refused to testify. Even in his weakened state, even with most of his power gone, the old man still inspired fear. People remembered what had happened to those who'd crossed him in the past. They remembered the bodies that had turned up in the Niagara River, the businesses that had mysteriously burned down, the families that had suddenly decided to move far away. The FBI continued its surveillance, but there was less and less to observe. Magaddino's meetings now were mostly with doctors and lawyers, rather than fellow gangsters. The conversations were about Medicare and Social Security, rather than murder and extortion. The lion had been defanged, but he was still a lion. Throughout 1973 and into 1974, Magaddino's health continued to deteriorate. The man who'd once stayed awake for days planning criminal operations could barely stay awake through dinner. The hands that had allegedly ordered hundreds of deaths shook when he tried to hold a coffee cup. Time, the one enemy no one could outrun or outgun, was catching up with Stefano Magaddino. On July 19, 1974, at Mount St. Mary's Hospital in Lewiston, New York, Stefano Magaddino's remarkable and terrible journey came to an end. He was 82 years old. The official cause of death was heart failure. Though some might say his heart had failed long before, failed to feel compassion for his victims, failed to choose legitimate work over crime, failed to see that his empire would crumble like all empires eventually do. His funeral was a strange affair, a mixture of old-world tradition and new-world caution. The FBI photographed everyone who attended, creating a who's who of organized crime figures. Old enemies sent flowers not out of respect, but to make sure he was really dead. The funeral procession wound through the streets of Niagara Falls, past the legitimate businesses that had fronted his criminal empire, past the homes of people whose lives he'd affected in ways both seen and unseen. Magaddino was buried in St. Joseph's Cemetery in Niagara Falls, his grave marked with a modest headstone that gave no hint of the power he'd once wielded. Visitors today would have no idea they were standing at the final resting place of one of the most powerful criminals in American history. There's no mention of the commission, no hint of the bootlegging empire, no reference to the decades of fear and violence. But Magaddino's death didn't end his story. The vacuum he left behind sparked a power struggle that would last for years. The Buffalo crime family, once one of the most stable and powerful in America, fragmented into warring factions. The connections to Canadian organized crime weakened and eventually broke. The empire he'd spent 50 years building collapsed in less than 5. The FBI recordings from the 1960s revealed intimate details of Magaddino's operations that had never before been exposed. In the 1960s, the FBI began eavesdropping on the Magaddino funeral home, recording 78,000 pages of transcripts. These weren't just casual conversations. They were the unguarded moments when a criminal empire revealed its true nature. When killers discussed their trade like businessmen discussing quarterly reports. The discovery of the hidden money created a wound in the Buffalo family that would never heal. Retired FBI agent Donald Hartnett said, at that time, Magaddino had been telling his underlings that money was tight, and he could not afford to pay them Christmas bonuses. People began to stop trusting him when we found all that money. Trust, once broken in the underworld, could never be fully restored. Men who had risked their lives for the family, who had gone to prison rather than cooperate with authorities, felt betrayed by the man they'd called father. In his final years, Magaddino watched everything he'd built crumble. The young men he'd brought into the life no longer showed him proper respect. The politicians he'd bought were now too scared to take his calls. The legitimate businessmen who'd once courted his favor now crossed the street to avoid him. He was like King Lear, raging against the dying of his criminal light. When boss Stefano Magaddino was arrested in 1968, Fino formed a faction along with John Camilleri and Daniel Sansonese Sr. that plotted to take over the family. Fino began acting as if he was boss until 1972, when he was summoned by the commission to explain his actions. When Fino went to the commission meeting, he was accompanied by his allies Daniel Sansonese Sr., Sam Frangiamore, and Roy Carlisi. The commission told Fino after the meeting that Magaddino was still the boss and his group was to back down. Even the commission, the body he'd helped create, couldn't save him. They might declare him still the boss, but everyone knew it was an empty title. Power in the underworld wasn't granted by committee, it was taken and held through fear and respect. And Magaddino had lost both. The tragedy of Stefano Magaddino wasn't just personal, it was generational. His son Peter, who'd been groomed to take over the empire, found himself tainted by association with the money scandal. His son Peter Magaddino, born on February 25, 1917, became a made member of the Buffalo Mafia family and married the niece of Buffalo mobster Charles Montana. But being a made man in a crumbling family was like inheriting a castle built on sand. What makes Magaddino's story particularly poignant is how completely his legacy was erased. It's hard to imagine what Stefano Magaddino might think of his criminal empire were he alive today. Nearly 30 years after he waited for death while FBI agents searched his house. No leadership, no allegiance to tradition, no money-making enterprises. Even his grandson and namesake, who at last report was practicing law in Atlanta, wanted no part of the realm. His grandson, bearing his name, chose law over lawlessness. Choosing to defend the system his grandfather had spent a lifetime subverting. There's a profound irony in that, the grandson of one of America's most powerful crime bosses, practicing the very law his grandfather had mocked and corrupted. After Magaddino fell from power and then died in 1974 without ever going to trial, the Buffalo mob had a succession of kingpins. The discovery of the $500,000 in Magaddino's son's house split his domain. Buffalo's mafiosi broke away. So did their compatriots in Rochester, Ontario, Pennsylvania. Ohio and the rest of the areas where the now-weakened Magaddino once reigned. And none of them was strong enough to merit a seat on the National High Commission. The Buffalo crime family, once feared from Cleveland to Montreal, became a cautionary tale whispered in the back rooms of social clubs. The young mobsters coming up in New York and Philadelphia would hear about Magaddino and shake their heads, the old man who hoarded money while his soldiers starved. The boss who organized the meeting that exposed them all. The king who died in exile in his own kingdom. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Magaddino's fall was how quickly he was forgotten by the legitimate world. The politicians who'd once taken his money now denied ever knowing him. The judges he'd owned pretended they'd never heard his name. The business leaders who'd profited from his protection acted as if he'd never existed. In death as in life, Stefano Magaddino remained in the shadows. The FBI's victory over Magaddino was bittersweet. They'd spent millions of dollars and countless man-hours bringing him down. But he died in his own bed, never spending a day in prison for his crimes. Stefano was arrested, but never faced any jail time because his lawyers kept delaying the trial on account of their client's alleged heart condition. Although Magaddino escaped jail time, his once commanding leadership was hampered by failing health and dwindling funds. The government had won the war but lost the final battle. Magaddino had beaten them in the only way that mattered to him. He'd died free. Today, if you drive through Niagara Falls, you can still see the remnants of Magaddino's empire. The funeral home still stands, though under different ownership. The old social clubs where his soldiers gathered are now trendy coffee shops or abandoned buildings. The routes his bootleggers used to smuggle liquor are now tourist paths. History has a way of sanitizing even the bloodiest stories. Wiretaps revealed that Stefano Magaddino's cut from a popular cigarette game controlled by his henchmen in an old firehouse on Seneca Street was $25 a week. But like a lot of businesses, the mob found that when the economy goes bad, profits shrink and eventually even disappear. The region's declining population, the loss of thousands of factory jobs with weekly incomes and convenient locales for betting played a major role in the decline of the Buffalo Mafia. The customer base evaporated, and mob leaders weren't wise enough or strong enough to find other sources of income to fill the void. The economic decline of Buffalo mirrored the decline of Magaddino's empire. As the factories closed and the population fled to the suburbs and the Sun Belt, the ecosystem that had sustained organized crime withered away. The loan sharks had no one to lend to, the numbers runners had no one to collect from. The protection rackets had no businesses left to protect. In many ways, Magaddino was the last of his kind, the immigrant who came to America with nothing and built a criminal empire through violence and cunning. The mobsters who came after him were American-born, educated. More sophisticated, perhaps, but lacking the primal hunger that had driven men like Magaddino to power. They didn't remember the poverty of Sicily, the desperation that made crime seem like the only option. They hadn't crossed an ocean in steerage, hadn't fought their way up from the streets with nothing but their fists and their wits. They were in many ways soft compared to the old lions like Magaddino. The story of Stefano Magaddino is ultimately a story about the price of power. Every empire he built, from bootlegging to gambling to labor racketeering, was built on blood and fear. Every dollar he earned was stained with someone's suffering. Every moment of triumph was balanced by someone else's tragedy. Consider the victims whose names we'll never know. The small business owners driven to bankruptcy by his extortion. The families destroyed by his loan sharks. The young men who died in his wars, buried in unmarked graves or dumped in the Niagara River. Magaddino's empire was built on their bones, mortared with their blood. That man was Stefano the Undertaker Magaddino, the mafia boss who ruled the Niagara frontier for half a century from the shadows of the falls. Born in 1891 in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, Magaddino came from the same Sicilian bloodlines that produced Joseph Bonanno. his great-nephew. After violent feuds and assassinations in his hometown, he fled to America in 1902 and joined the secret world of the Castellammers clan in New York. After being tied to what became known as the Good Killers case, a series of revenge murders between Sicilian factions, Magaddino fled New York City. He landed quietly in Niagara Falls, where he would soon turn the border into his personal kingdom. There's something deeply American about Magaddino's story, despite its criminal nature. He was, in his own twisted way, living the American dream, the immigrant who made good, who built something from nothing, who refused to accept the limitations of his birth. That his empire was criminal doesn't change the fact that it required the same skills that built legitimate American fortune's vision: determination, ruthlessness, and an ability to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. But unlike the Rockefellers or Carnegies, Magaddino's name would never grace libraries or museums. His charitable contributions, such as they were, came with strings attached: loyalty, silence, complicity. He gave to the church, but the priests who took his money knew where it came from and chose to look the other way. The emotional core of Magaddino's story lies in its contradictions. Here was a man who valued family above all else, yet destroyed countless families through his crimes. A man who spoke of honor and tradition while living a life built on dishonor and betrayal. A man who attended church every Sunday, then ordered murders on Monday. Perhaps the most tragic figure in this story isn't Magaddino himself, but his wife Carmela. Magaddino married Carmela, and the couple had 4 children. She spent over 50 years married to a man whose business was death, who brought danger into their home, who made her children targets simply by being born. What was it like for her, knowing that every knock on the door could be the police or assassins? How did she explain to her children why their father's friends kept disappearing? Why they had to move houses in the middle of the night? Why other children weren't allowed to play with them? The women in these stories are often forgotten, but they bore a unique burden. They couldn't choose this life the way their husbands did. They were born into it or married into it, and once in, there was no escape except death. They raised children in homes where violence was always just beneath the surface, where love and fear were inextricably intertwined. As Magaddino's health failed in his final years, one wonders what went through his mind. Did he regret the path he'd chosen? Did he think about the men he'd ordered killed, the families he'd destroyed? Or did he go to his grave believing he'd simply done what he had to do to survive and thrive in a hostile world? Magaddino died of a heart attack on July 19, 1974, at age 82, at Mount St. Mary's Hospital in Lewiston, New York. His funeral was held at St. Joseph's Catholic Church. He was buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery on Pine Avenue in Niagara Falls. The funeral itself was a study in contrasts. The church where his funeral mass was held had been built partly with his donations. Yet the priest conducting the service had to wrestle with giving last rites to a man whose life had been devoted to breaking most of the commandments. The FBI agents photographing mourners outside were documenting the last gathering of an era that was already ending. In the cemetery, as they lowered his coffin into the ground, one could almost hear the echoes of all the funerals he'd caused, all the graves he'd filled. The man who'd made his fortune partly through a funeral home was now just another body being returned to the earth. The undertaker had become the undertaken. The aftermath of Magaddino's death revealed the true fragility of the empire he'd built. Without his force of personality, without his connections and cunning, it all fell apart. The Buffalo crime family descended into irrelevance, a footnote in the history of American organized crime. The routes he'd used to smuggle liquor became tourist attractions. The men he'd commanded either died, went to prison, or simply faded away. Today, the Mafia, as Magaddino knew it, is essentially dead. The code of omerta that once ensured silence has been shattered by countless cooperating witnesses. The political protection that once seemed impregnable has evaporated. The communities that once provided a recruiting ground have assimilated into mainstream American life. Before we continue, a quick clarification. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. This content does not promote, glorify, justify, or encourage violence, criminal behavior, gangs, or illegal activity of any kind. The intent is to educate viewers about real-world crimes, their consequences, and the social and psychological factors behind them. All events discussed are based on publicly available information and are presented to highlight their consequences. Viewer discretion is advised. However, arrests by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Project Outremer's indicate the pronouncements about the Buffalo crime family's demise were overstated. In November 2017, the FBI and Canadian newspapers indicated the family is still active. In November 2017, Giuseppe Joe and Domenico Violi, who have long-standing ties to the Buffalo mob, were arrested on narcotics trafficking charges. These charges show a continuation of the long-established Mafia drug trafficking triangle from Toronto, Hamilton, Ontario to Buffalo and Montreal to New York City, established by Stefano Magaddino and his cousin, Joseph Bonanno. Yet traces remain, like archaeological evidence of a lost civilization. The drug trafficking routes Magaddino established still exist, though now run by different groups. The corruption he fostered in local governments left scars that took decades to heal. The culture of organized crime he helped create influenced everything from movies to music to our understanding of American history. What then are we to make of Stefano Magaddino? Was he a monster or a man of his times? A criminal mastermind or a prisoner of circumstances? The truth, as always, is more complex than any simple label can capture. He was certainly a criminal, responsible for untold suffering. But he was also a product of his environment, born into a world where violence was currency and power was survival. He didn't create the Mafia, he inherited it, shaped it, and ultimately was destroyed by it. The most profound tragedy of Stefano Magaddino's life might be what he could have been. He possessed intelligence, organizational skills, charisma, and determination that, directed toward legitimate ends, could have built something lasting and valuable. Instead, he built an empire of shadows that dissolved the moment the light hit it. His story serves as a warning about the seductive nature of power and the corrosive effects of crime. Every young man who thinks the gangster life is glamorous should know how it ends, not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow decline. Watching everything you built crumble while former friends become enemies and the government closes in. But there's another lesson here, one about America itself. Magaddino's empire was only possible because of the corruption that ran through American society like veins through marble. Every judge he bribed, every cop he owned, every politician he bought, they were all complicit in his crimes. He didn't corrupt them, he revealed the corruption that was already there. In the end, Stefano Magaddino's greatest crime might not have been murder or extortion or bootlegging. It might have been showing us how easily American democracy could be subverted, how readily justice could be bought, how quickly law and order could break down when enough money was involved. As you stand at his grave today in St. Joseph's Cemetery, you see nothing remarkable. A simple headstone marking the remains of a man who once commanded an empire. Families picnic nearby, unaware their feet from one of the most powerful criminals in American history. Children play where blood was once spilled. Life, legitimate and lawful, has reclaimed the territory Magaddino once ruled through fear. But sometimes, when the wind blows across Lake Erie and the mist rises from Niagara Falls, you can almost imagine you hear the echoes of the past, the rumble of boats crossing the river at night, the whispered conversations in Italian, the sound of a door being kicked in, a trigger being pulled, a life being ended. These echoes remind us that Stefano Magaddino's story isn't really over. It lives on in every criminal organization that tries to corrupt our institutions, in every official who takes a bribe, in every citizen who looks the other way when crime pays better than honesty. His empire might be dead, but the conditions that created it, poverty, discrimination, corruption, and greed, still exist. The final irony of Stefano Magaddino's life is that he achieved a kind of immortality. Just not the kind he might have wanted. He's remembered not as a successful businessman or a community leader, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when ambition divorces itself from morality, when power becomes its own justification. And perhaps that's the most fitting epitaph for Stefano Magaddino. He got everything he wanted and lost everything that mattered. He ruled an empire and died essentially alone. He accumulated vast wealth and watched it tear his organization apart. He demanded respect through fear and died largely unmourned. In the quiet of that cemetery, with the sound of the falls in the distance, the truth becomes clear. Stefano Magaddino's life was not a triumph but a tragedy. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded at the wrong things. He built an empire on suffering and wondered why it brought him no peace. He chose power over principle and found that power without principle is ultimately powerless. The story of Stefano Magaddino, the Undertaker of Buffalo, ends not with a bang but with a whimper. The man who once made governors tremble and police commissioners look the other way died as just another elderly patient in a hospital bed. The empire he spent 50 years building didn't survive him by even 5 years. The family he claimed to value above all else was torn apart by his choices. Yet in this ending there's a kind of justice, not the justice of courts and prisons, Magaddino escaped that, but the justice of history, which remembers him not as he wanted to be remembered, but as he was. A criminal whose life serves as a warning to others, whose legacy is one of violence and betrayal, whose empire was built on sand and inevitably returned to dust. This is how empires truly end, not in grand battles or heroic last stands, but in hospital rooms and empty funeral homes, in children who change their names and grandchildren who choose different paths. They end when the fear fades and people realize the emperor has no clothes, when the money runs out and the protection disappears, when time itself becomes the enemy that no amount of power can defeat. Stefano Magaddino ruled the Buffalo underworld for over 50 years. But in the end, the underworld ruled him, consumed him, and ultimately destroyed everything he'd built. The man who'd started with nothing and built an empire died with nothing that truly mattered. The Undertaker who'd buried so many others was finally buried himself, and with him an era of American crime that will never come again. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Stefano Magaddino's life, that crime. No matter how organized, no matter how powerful, no matter how long it lasts, always ends the same way. In loss, in loneliness, and in the cold ground of a cemetery where no amount of money or power can follow. The empire of shadows he built has returned to shadows. And only the story remains, a warning, a cautionary tale, a reminder that in America, even kings can fall, and even the mightiest empires are only temporary.